Hello and welcome to Join the Dots. This is a new Real Media show coming to you fortnightly. I'm Kam Sandhu.
I'm Ranjan.
This is our first episode. So just to tell you a little bit about what this is all about, Join the Dots, as it says in the title, is all about pulling together certain aspects of a term or an issue or a theme that is very, very prevalent in politics, but still remains perhaps quite mysterious. Would you agree?
Yeah, just connecting up what's going on in the various stories and what's missing. What's going on, what are we not being told, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the first thing that we're going to talk about in the first episode is deregulation. Now, we were going to talk about this anyway, but the reason that we're going to make this our first episode is because Grenfell has happened. The details of that are still coming out. And even though it happened weeks ago, we still feel like there's no one to blame. We still don't feel like whose responsibility is this tragedy.
Yeah, and because we're massive geeks, we've already asked questions to certain people about regulation. And it turns out that deregulation might not exist, re-regulation, all these other variations. There's a reason why it's so confusing, because it's purposely vague.
Exactly. And we might as well go straight to one of our first clips. We spoke to David Graeber, anthropologist and author, a few weeks before the election. And this is him talking about whether deregulation means anything at all.
Something that I noticed when I watched Nigel Farage interview Marine Le Pen was the difference in their views on deregulation. Trump openly loves deregulation, so does Farage, and Marine Le Pen says that she's completely against it.
Which is fascinating because, I mean, the phrase deregulation is such a sort of ideological, I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, I looked into this and essentially it's all about getting in the first claim. They always say in law, it's like who sues who first, or claims damages first is 98% of everything. It's the same thing. Who gets to claim their legislative change is a deregulation rather than a regulation, it sets the entire argument. So that in America, you had the deregulation of the banks and the deregulation of like the telecommunications industry. In the telecommunications case, it was getting rid of a managed competition between a few oligopolies and opening up to like a lot of mid-range firms competing with each other. In banks, it's exactly the other way around. They start with a bunch of mid-range firms competing with each other, or the airlines, I'm sorry, banks too, and they end up with a few oligopolies. So either one is called deregulation. They're exactly the opposite thing. So like all that deregulation means is changing the regulatory structure in a way I like.
Right, so deregulation can be consolidation and deregulation can be competition.
Exactly. It's not about getting rid of government interference because, like, let's face it, banks can't actually be deregulated. Banks are institutions that governments give the right to make up money. You can't say you can make up money any way you like. That would be absurd. Then they just print money and keep it. Banks are intrinsically regulated. Their very existence has to be regulated. They are themselves a form of regulation.
So that was David Graeber talking about deregulation with Real Media a few weeks ago. What are your thoughts on what he said?
Well, I suppose it speaks for itself. It's an extremely confusing thing if you think about it from the point of view as deregulation is good or it means something. That actually it can mean whatever you want. It's the person who says I'm changing the law can just say I deregulated everything.
Yeah. And one of the kind of common tropes is to back deregulation is to suggest that the state is interfering too much, right? The burdensome red tape, deregulation, we need it because the state is holding us back. It just needs to get out of the way. And this is, David Graeber is an anarchist, so he's not interested in state interference. But this is not about that. This is about how this term is weaponized for certain people to get what they want.
Yeah, I think he's saying that the state isn't disappearing at all. The only thing that's happening is there's less people are officially responsible for stuff when it goes wrong.
Which brings us back to Grenfell, which is the reason that we're talking about deregulation today. Obviously, we've had the government, Sajid Javid said that the government was pursuing a deregulation agenda last year, in March 2016, when he made a speech. We heard lots of stuff about the burdensome red tape, which is now coming back to harm the Conservatives, perhaps. And in this year, we had, some of you may not have heard about it, we had a red tape initiative being set up. And the people involved in that were Oliver Letwin, Michael Gove. This was cross-party, so there was Liam Byrne, there was Joe Swinson. So on top of the deregulation that had already happened, We had a red tape initiative being set up this year to remove even more red tape.
Yeah, and also Sajid Javid, when he, after Cameron came in, after the deregulation bill was passed, he then said, when he came in, he said, okay, everybody, let's get ready for more deregulation. So it's almost the third round.
Yeah, and that's the 2015 bill was before that, and that was described as a mini TTIP, wasn't it?
Yes, so TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the deal between the US and the EU, we've covered that in one of our films. Yeah, when I was following people who were protesting that, then they told me about the deregulation bill, which I hadn't heard about. And that sort of took lots of different pre-existing UK legislation and changed bits of it in order to make it more corporate friendly. There was one very controversial, many, but there was one very specifically overarching controversial part in it, which was the growth clause, which I believe was clause 88,
right,
which said that regulators, regulatory bodies, need to think about growth, about growth of the economy above other priorities. Else. Yeah.
Regulators need to think about growth above anything else.
Well, yeah, different people have said to me different things about whether it is above everything else, but they have to really take that into account.
Interesting. We actually have a post that we found here from 2015 by Jen Person, who's talking about clause 88, the bingo clause. Yeah. And yeah, if I can just read the opening of this, because it's quite chilling when we first found it. So this is from clause 88, the bingo clause of the deregulation bill from February 2015. Lord Tunnicliffe asked in Parliament on November 20th, 2014, are these new clauses a licence for regulators to approve regulations that kill people to save money?
Yeah, so that's part of the deregulation bill debate. It got passed in the end. You kicked up a bit of a fuss about it at the time though, didn't you? Yeah, well, other people told me about it and they were trying to do something about it. Jen Person was one of the people who was doing quite a lot about it. Yeah, I remember calling The Guardian and raising it amongst certain campaigning groups. Nobody thought it was very important, to be honest. Some people said that there was too many other things going on. The Guardian certainly did. Campaigning groups, it's just not very sexy, is it? Saying, oh, the deregulation bill. People didn't really... I think they were more interested in talking about the environment and these other things as if this had nothing to do with it. But,
yeah.
I mean, it's hard to explain, you know, it's so dry, it's boring-eyed, isn't it?
And Person describes it in that post actually as very bland, right? How do you get people to talk about deregulation? You know, it's unfortunate that something like Grenfell has forced it onto the agenda.
I would say it's forced regulation onto the agenda, and the absence of regulation. Has the word deregulation been used much?
No,
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, we had John McDonnell saying recently that the people in Grenfell were murdered because of political decisions and political choices. We now have a clip coming from David White, corruption expert, who talks about deregulation as, in fact, re-regulation of ideas, of economic ideas under neoliberalism.
When governments say we're deregulating because we're allowing you to buy toxic debts wherever you want or develop new derivative products that we're not going to impose rules on, of course that's deregulation of a particular segment of the market. But the market as a whole is regulated. It's regulated from root to branch. So all we're looking at is a different form of regulation, a regulation that gives governments, that gives corporations a free rein or allows them to make profits in a much quicker way. So governments always regulate markets, they always regulate economies and corporations, they just do it in particular ways. And sometimes it's better for us and sometimes it's much worse for us. And I think in the last 30 to 40 years, the process of re-regulation under neoliberal economic systems has made us much worse off.
So that was David White, corruption expert, saying that deregulation or re-regulation under neoliberalism has left us worse off. In the case of banking, specifically, which is what he mentioned at the start there and what Graeber mentioned, I'd say that's pretty difficult to argue against, wouldn't you?
Yeah, sure. Financial crisis caused by, again, people having their investments invested in things that they didn't understand. It's happened many times before, but it looks like they'd pioneered and innovated to the point where it happened again in an unprecedented scale.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, we've got an extract here speaking specifically about deregulation or regulation, or whatever we understand that to be. This is from Ian Fraser's Shredded, Inside RBS, the Bank That Broke Britain, which is recommended reading on both the parts, yes. I would say. Brown congratulated himself for resisting pressure to toughen up the regulation of their activities, bankers' activities. Thanks to the bankers' brilliant ingenuity and remarkable achievements, he said, Britain was living in an era that history will record as the beginning of a new golden age. Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Ed Balls, was no less unctuous towards the banking fraternity. Speaking in 2006, Balls said it was essential that banks should make turbocharged profits, adding, "My starting point as a Treasury Minister is this. What more can I do, can we do together, to support and enhance the critical role that banking plays in our economy?" Even as late as May 2007, Balls was championing the rights of bankers to do as they choose and insisting that government's main role was to reduce regulatory interference, even though it was already clear to many others that the fraud-based global credit bubble had burst. Speaking to a committee of the House of Lords that month, Balls praised the FSA from the rooftops for its lightness of touch, saying it is very unusual to be a government minister who is able to say with credibility on a public platform that the UK system of regulation is a substantial competitive advantage to the British economy. But you can absolutely say that in the case of the financial services industry. He added that the FSA's approach, the FSA being the regulator by the way, gives the financial services sector the ability to innovate and to be flexible and is a big competitive strength for us, but we always need to be mindful of the need to reduce the burdens where we can. Wow. That's a very revealing extract, again from Ian Fraser's Shredded, describing really a moment where there was so much audacity about, with politicians able to say, yeah, deregulation is the thing. What we need to do is not interfere with banks, even when that picture was crumbling.
Oh, yeah, at that late stage. And interesting that he says, you know, this is the UK's main selling point. I remember speaking to Ian Fraser when he released that book, and he said that exactly that. The UK was saying we have a lower regulation than the US, so come and float your company on the British stock market, and you'll be able to get away with basically all sorts of human rights abuses and etc. etc. No one will ask any questions. Yep,
and that's one of the things I guess we're talking about with regulation, is that in this language we've stopped seeing the human impact of these things. And we're actually going to go back to David White, who's going to be talking about corporations and why we should be less trusting. And this kind of touches on the public-private relationship that we've seen at Grenfell, that we've seen during privatisation under neoliberalism. Here's David White.
One of the things that we need to contemplate in terms of the relationship between governments and corporations is that we trust corporations too much. And you know, and I don't say that as someone who is a naturally mistrusting person, right? But I just mean that we have a completely wrong idea of how we think about private companies, about corporations. We think of them as citizens in their own right with responsibilities, and the whole corporate social responsibility debate is all about how potentially companies can make our lives better. And we forget, actually, that the bottom line is always the bottom line. We forget that companies are there primarily and are under a legal obligation to maximise returns, financial returns for their shareholders. So if we take that legal fact seriously, then we have to say, well, we can't trust them necessarily to control the things that affect our lives and our livelihoods the most. I mean, you know, we can't trust them to supply energy, right? We can't trust them to run prisons, or to you know, the Atos case, and Maximus, of course, doing very similar things now to assess people as fit for work because they get profits from doing that, and what we end up with is an economy in which we forget about the human impact of corporate activities because we trust companies. So we have to stop trusting companies, and we have to stop seeing the interests of governments and the people and companies as being one and the same, because they're not. We have to sever that relationship.
So strong words there from David White, discussing why we shouldn't be so trusting of corporations. We've talked about how the market can't exist without the state. We've talked about how deregulation is in fact re-regulation, or in fact might not mean anything at all. We've talked about how that term has been used to further the kind of neoliberal agenda and the economy. And we've also talked about how the structure of corporations means that we shouldn't be trusting of them if we take the fact that they need to put their profits first seriously.
Yeah, I think this idea that the state and the corporations are separate is something that David White's work that I've read, it basically says that they work together. You know, the state doesn't disappear. People talk about globalization, meaning the state has less power and the companies and the markets have more power. But what he says is that it just reinforces the power of the state, which things like Snoopers Charter and things like that would also
very good
go
example.
on to.
Well, that's all we've got time for today. Hopefully you found this useful. We want to hear from you, so like, share, comment, tell us what you think about deregulation, and we'll be back very soon with another episode. See you next time.